Hello, my name is Rosa. I'm an interpreter.
Hello, my name is Rosa. I'm an interpreter.
And today's video is about remote simultaneous interpretation via Zoom.
And today's video is about remote simultaneous interpretation via Zoom.
This is not a tutorial about this feature.
This is not a tutorial about this feature.
These are all the things I wish I would have known before my first assignment.
These are all the things I wish I would have known before my first assignment.
To give you some context, in the last few months, I've used the RSI tool in Zoom.
I've used the RSI tool in Zoom
to interpret at events like virtual town halls, where there are multiple speakers, and anywhere from dozens to hundreds of attendees. So it's different from what it would be like to interpret remotely for a court, for example. But most things I'll share would apply regardless of the type of event. If you'll be using simultaneous interpretation feature.
The simultaneous interpretation feature.
Prior to most events, I've been invited to participate in a tech call. Where organizers make sure everyone knows to maneuver Zoom.
How to manage Zoom.
And to check if everyone's video and audio are working properly. In this meeting, clients may ask you to introduce yourself and say a few phrases. And this is just to check your audio quality. So saying your name and something brief should be enough. It's not necessary to tell the client a long story about your day or anything like that, unless they ask you to. These tech meetings are a great opportunity to request any supporting material available to prepare for the assignment. Ask for slides, names and bios of the speakers, the event's agenda, poll questions, and anything relevant to the presentation. One thing I've noticed is that since most people are sitting in front of a computer, many tend to read what they are going to say, which makes their pace very different meaning a lot faster,
meaning a lot faster,
from what it would be like
from what it would be like
if they were speaking naturally.
if they were speaking naturally.
So also ask if they could send you whatever script they'll be reading too.
They will be reading too.
In my case, I haven't had much luck with that, but
I haven't had much luck with that.
But I still ask. Check with the client.
Check with the client.
Who will be your point of
contact
during the event,
and
ask for their name,
email
and phone number
in
case you run into issues. Also confirm with the client if they prefer to have you on video or not. In my experience, my clients prefer that only speakers have their cameras on. So it's always good to ask. If they don't want me on video, I like to remove my profile picture from Zoom. And I rename myself as Spanish interpreter dash my name to remain completely inconspicuous.
Discreet.
If there won't be a tech call, request all this information by email. Or phone, or however the client or agency contacted you, and
they give you.
Ask if you can log in at least 30 minutes before the event starts. To make sure everything is set up properly. This may sound like it's pretty obvious. But make sure you have the actual Zoom link for the event at least one day before. It won't necessarily be the same link as the tech meeting. And if it's a recurrent event,
on the current event,
don't just assume will be the same link every time. Ask the client. Right now, Zoom only lists 9 default languages in their interpretation tool. But there is a very simple way to add more languages
manually,
which would be custom languages. You can add as many as you want, but there is a limit of 5 custom languages that can be used at the same time. It's important to know this because a colleague of mine who was a Vietnamese interpreter which surprisingly is not one of the default
languages
suggested as a workaround, listing her under another language. I think it was Japanese. And attendees were notified to select Japanese if they wanted to hear the audio in Vietnamese, which was a little confusing. But I'm not sure if this feature to manually add custom languages available at the time. The interpreting feature has to be enabled prior to the event. But once you are at the event, make sure your
log into the event,
which is actually assigned
to you.
Depending on whether the event was set up as a webinar
or meeting,
you may or may not
get the
welcome you have been assigned as an interpreter message upon logging in. And by the way, I noticed
that
some features are slightly different depending on whether the event was set up as a webinar or as a meeting. So keep that in mind. In some events, as soon as they assign my language, they can't hear me in the main channel. Even if I select it. So now I've learned that this is one of the things I have to check with the client. Before the event starts. In case they want me to make any announcements in the main channel. You will only be able to hear audio from the main channel. But people who tune into yours from the main channel, but people who tune into yours
would be able
to hear you at 80% volume, and the main speaker at 20% volume by default. But they can choose to mute the original audio if they prefer.
If you prefer.
For relay interpreting, you need to log in using a secondary device. So you can join as an attendee select the language channel that will be your source. If you're working with a colleague as
a team,
you need to come up with
a
system to communicate with each other, to hand over the mic through a channel outside of Zoom, because you won't be able to hear each other within Zoom and communicating via the Zoom chat can be complicated since sometimes a lot of people are typing messages at the same time. Speaking of which, as if focusing on simultaneously interpretation wasn't enough, we'll have to think about the chat. That part always gets me because I feel attendees who need interpretation miss out on information posted in the chat unless there is someone translating those messages in real time. So another important thing to bring up to the client before the event is how the chat is going to be handled. Sometimes there are designated people to handle the chat, but it's important to establish that from the beginning, because otherwise they might expect you to do it, or it can be overlooked. And finally, if there will be breakout rooms in your event, confirm the logistics with the organizers beforehand. In my experience, things tend to get a little crazy when people split up into breakout rooms. Some people get lost in a Zoom black hole and can't log back in. People don't know what they're supposed to do. And in my experience, it just turns into a hot mess. Confirm if you will be actively interpreting in the breakout room, what participants will do, and how and when you will return to the main room. Please bear in mind that this is a relatively new tool, and it's constantly changing. So some of these
things
might change by next week.
Might change by the next week.
But these are the main things I've noticed. Or experienced. Whenever I've interpreted
simultaneously
using Zoom. And I really hope this will help you know what questions to ask and to avoid some of the issues I run into over the last few months. Thank you so much for watching. Adiós.
Ok, creo que eso fue muy demandante, la verdad. Mi voz ya está un poquito, mi garganta ya está un poquito cansada, me duele de hecho un poquito. Y por ello puedo notar que esta práctica ha sido larga, y un poco demandante en sí. Sentí que decías cosas muy claro, pero mi mayor problema era recordar toda la oración. Ese fue mi mayor problema. Pero yo creo que logré poder transmitir el video lo mejor que pude. Ya no me queda casi voz para hablar, pero puedo sacar algo bueno de esta práctica, que fue practicar más, y espero que en algún punto pueda realizar estas prácticas de una manera más fluida y casi sin errores. Así que, sin nada más que agregar, eso es todo por el momento. Así que, bye bye.